On Monday local time, Israel carried out a new round of airstrikes in Rafah, a city in southern Gaza.
Residents were awoken to a barrage of bombardments.
That's Post reporter Miriam Berker. She's based in Jerusalem, and for months, Miriam has been covering the war that started after the October 7th attacks by Hamas.
And Israeli officials said that this bombardment occurred during a rescue attempt to find two of the more than 100 hostages still held by Hamas.
Miriam says the successful rescue of these two hostages came at an important moment for Israel, which has been facing mounting pressure to bring its remaining hostages home. But in the rescue process, the Israeli military said two of its soldiers were killed. Gazan authorities say at least 67 Palestinians, including women and children, were killed in the airstrikes. Miriam says the strikes were especially alarming to the many Gazans who have fled to Rafah during the war.
And it's become effectively the last so-called refuge in Gaza, with the caveat that Gazans will say that nowhere is safe because bombardments continue everywhere and disease is spreading fast. And there's a whole host of dangers everywhere you go.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Monday, February 12th. Today, Miriam explains what led up to Israel's latest operation in Gaza and what this tells us about Israel's strategy going forward. Miriam, before we get into more of the details of what's happening on the ground right now, I want to step back and ask, how did we get to this point? Can you just tell us, where is Rafah and why did Israel strike there? Because it does seem like much of this war has been concentrated elsewhere in Gaza.
So Rafah is the southernmost major city in Gaza. It also borders Egypt. And so the Rafah crossing between Egypt and Gaza, which is the only land crossing that Israel doesn't control, is there as well. And, it was an important city before the war, but now 1.4 million estimated more Gazans are now living there, and that's out of about 2.2 million people.
Wow.
And people have been fleeing there for months. This has become the place where the most aid has been able to reach, where the most people have poured in, and where in recent days the Israeli government, Israeli authorities have said that, they are planning to go in. They say that Hamas fighters are now, underground in that city, and they are, have not made formal calls for people to evacuate yet, but have said that this, is coming.
So Rafah is a place where there are high concentrations of Palestinians, people in Gaza who have fled to that point, and now Israel is saying that there were Hamas leaders hiding there. So did Israel set out to launch these attacks in Rafah because it says Hamas is hiding there? Why did Israel target Rafah at this point?
Israel's military said that it carried out a series of strikes in the early hours of Monday local time, based off what they said intelligence they had about the location of these two hostages who are Israeli Argentinian citizens. They said that these strikes were effectively enabled their soldiers to come in into this residential area where they said Hamas was holding the hostages. It caused a lot of panic for people because, one, it was a very deadly night. According to Gazan authorities, some 67 people were killed. And it also comes when people are really bracing for an Israeli ground operation and intensified bombardments. The sort of pattern that people have seen before was that before Israeli troops went into an area, they would, call for evacuations and have these really intense bombardments, which in part Palestinians said made it very difficult for them to leave because often they were being told to flee, while simultaneously under attack. So far, Israel hasn't laid out any specific evacuation orders. Hasn't said like you should take these roads and go to this place. The understanding is that those plans are in place and just have not been ordered yet. There's intense pressure, international pressure, especially from Washington, to prevent this sort of ground invasion from human rights groups, etc. Washington and the Biden administration has said, there has to be a clear way for civilians to evacuate before there is such a ground invasion of Rafah. And, again, Palestinians there say that there's, largely everyone's been displaced multiple times who lives there by now. And, just based off of past experiences, that there's really no safe way to have this many people leave this area during this fighting, and that there's, basically nowhere left safe in Gaza as well.
Yeah, and Miriam, I'm also wondering about the 2 hostages who were rescued by Israeli forces. It's probably such a relief for their families that they're back. Do we know who they are and how they're doing?
So they were 60-year-old Fernando Simon Merman and 70-year-old Luis Har. The Israeli military says that they are in good medical condition. They've been taken for further medical examination in Israel. This is sort of standard procedure that we have seen in the few instances. This is the second successful attempt by Israeli forces to bring back hostages, and this is in addition to there having been a week-long humanitarian pause, which included the exchange of Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners. And so, they'll undergo also, being questioned by Israeli authorities so that they, that people there can learn as much as they can also about the conditions of the remaining hostages.
Miriam, you had mentioned a humanitarian pause last year, and I think many of us remember that. It led to the release of more than 100 hostages held by Hamas. And this is now months later where a military operation has resulted in 2 hostages being rescued. So why is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu taking this military approach rather than another approach to recovering hostages?
So there is simultaneously going on right now also negotiations with Hamas facilitated by other countries such as Qatar, Egypt, the United States is involved, trying to negotiate a longer term. It's sort of the framework right now is this sort of 3-phase pause in fighting, which would then also include hostage release, prisoner release, more aid to Gaza, a cessation of fighting. And as you noted, this tension between these 2 dual strategies of negotiating the return of hostages and bringing the hostages back through force is really very divisive in Israel right now. The Israeli government stated goal is to destroy Hamas and bring back the hostages. There's been increasing criticism from within the military, even from within Netanyahu's cabinet right now when it comes to the war, and then widespread within Israel over whether those 2 stated goals are actually compatible or incompatible with each other. And so there's a growing force in Israel that's saying, like, we need to bring the hostages back now. There's this war that majority of Israelis definitely support, but there's a feeling right now that, by force is not going to be the way to bring people back. Every day that they're still left there, they could die from bombardments, from disease. Their situation gets worse and worse. And so there's a lot of, protests right now led by families of some of those who are hostages, by some of those who've returned already, to demand that there be, a big focus on bringing the hostages back, through some sort of negotiations.
After the break, how Netanyahu has responded to the criticisms of his approach. We'll be right back. So, Miriam, as you laid out, there's 2 dual strategies, this one getting the hostages back by force and one through negotiations. If there's increasing criticism on Netanyahu and his government about the strategy to get the hostages back through force, why is he still pursuing that? What has he said about that being the effective and needed approach to this?
So, Netanyahu has said that the war is the only way to bring people back. He and his supporters have said, it's important to bring back these hostages, but we have to defend, in their eyes, they have to defend the state of Israel. They have to destroy Hamas. They have to make it so that October 7th can't happen again.
You have to dismantle. Hamas is a military force that controls territory. We're well and within reach, and we shouldn't stop.
And so the calls to rein in the ground operations, in order to, one, protect Palestinian civilians, those calls to international communities, or B, from within Israel, really to bring back the hostages, fall on deaf ears for Netanyahu.
Those who say that under no circumstances should we enter Rafah are basically saying, lose the war, keep Hamas there. And Hamas's promise to do the October 7th massacre over and over and over again.
And what about Israel's strongest international ally, the United States? You mentioned criticisms. How has President Biden responded to what Netanyahu is doing in Rafah?
So all in all, the United States has been and remains Israel's staunchest ally, both in terms of diplomatic support for this war and in terms of financial support in terms of weapons, etc. What we have heard, though, the kind of language you will hear from the Biden administration when it comes to criticism about plans for a ground operation in Rafah, increasing calls to lessen the civilian toll. So President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, they spoke Sunday by phone for about 45 minutes. And this was the first time they had talked in 3 weeks. And so, during this call, Biden, we are told, sort of emphasized that there had to be a protection of civilians, and that this is sort of a constant discussion between the two of them. This is according to, a White House briefing for reporters after this. And that this sort of was left as a huge question about how civilians could be spared from an Israeli offensive, in Rafah. And this comes after last week when Biden said that the war in Gaza had become over the top. It has killed more than 28,000 people, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Nearly 70,000 have been injured in Gaza.
I'm of the view, as you know, that the conduct of the response in the Gaza Strip has been over the top.
And, this was, again, some of the most pointed criticism we've heard from Biden, since the war began, after the October 7th attack, and amid, real divides within the Democratic Party amongst, many people who are very frustrated with, what they see as Washington providing cover for Israel's war.
So, Miriam, how is the rest of the world responding to this operation in Rafah, and what could that mean looking ahead for Israel?
British Foreign Secretary David Cameron, has said he's deeply concerned about the prospects of this ground offensive in Rafah.
We are very concerned about what is happening in Rafah because, let's be clear, the people there, many of them have moved 4, 5, 6 times before getting there. And it really, we think, is impossible to see how you can fight a war amongst these people. There's nowhere for them to go.
EU Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell, Germany's foreign ministry, they've all warned that this ground incursion could be catastrophic. The head of the United Nations said that this would, increase what's already a humanitarian nightmare.
And I'm especially alarmed by reports that the Israeli military intends to focus next on Rafah, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been squeezed in a desperate search for safety. Such an action would exponentially increase what is already a humanitarian nightmare with untold regional consequences.
Aid organizations, United Nations, and even, again, Israel's allies have been warning that this, will be so catastrophic for Gazan civilians. And, the bulk of those who've been killed, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, have been women and children so far in this war. And so there's just huge fears about what this could mean. Again, Rafah is the main place where aid's been able to be distributed as of right now. Even then, it's still, not enough at all in order, to address the growing needs. There's looming famine. A huge proportion of Gazans are going hungry and starving. And then asking, 1.4 million people to, move elsewhere in a war zone. There's no precedent for that right now that people can point to and say, okay, well, in terms of being able to say that this might work at all.
So, I mean, given the international pressure, and then also, the United States being Israel's strongest ally, and that President Biden has been making some of these remarks lately and having reportedly this phone call with Netanyahu. What does it, I guess, say, Miriam, that Netanyahu is still taking this approach and this tack? What does that tell us about how this war will go on from here?
I think this war has shown, in a lot of ways, both the limits and the sort of consequences of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East over recent years, from the Trump administration and then, continuing with the Biden administration. Right now, U.S. pressure has been able to, have somewhat of an influence, it seems, on Israeli policy. But the sort of destructiveness of this war has continued on. And Israel says it's going to continue until it accomplishes its goal, which it says is, eradicating Hamas, destroying the militant group. What that means for, the remaining Gazans who haven't been killed, who are now displaced, who are now up against the border with Egypt. Egypt, who's had a longstanding peace treaty with Israel, says that it will not accept, all of these Palestinian refugees onto its soil, which would effectively be, sort of another mass displacement of Palestinians, which they experienced with the founding of Israel. All of these elements have really underscored that, the longstanding sort of logic of U.S. policy in the region is not holding. And Israel definitely, sees this as an existential fight. Palestinians also see this as an existential fight. And they don't see the U.S. as at all having, been a neutral party in this. And, this has repercussions. Israel in the occupied territories, in the immediate region, in the Gulf, all around the world right now. In a lot of ways, what happens in this war is going to be, having a huge impact on U.S. policy and U.S. options for years to come.
Miriam, thank you so much for joining and explaining all this for us.
Thank you for having me.
Miriam Berger covers the war in Gaza for The Post. At a press conference today, Israeli spokesman Eylon Levy said his country's military was preparing to ramp up ground operations in Rafah. Levy said Israel already, quote, successfully swept through most of the Gaza Strip from the north. Levy also said most of Hamas's surviving forces were in Rafah, a claim the Post could not immediately verify. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Rennie Svirnovsky. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Ariel Plotnick and Lucy Perkins. Thanks also to Emma Talkoff. If you're looking for the latest updates on the big news of the day, check out our morning news briefing, The 7. We bring you the 7 stories you need to know about every weekday morning by 7 a.m. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.